Well, today it is a lecture, and we will face a very important issue. And this is the first diagnostic interview when you meet a client for the first time, or when he or she decides to start a therapy and does not really know whether to do it with you or with somebody else. Of course, there is a diagnostic interview, very important to be held in the beginning. And I will show you, on the one hand, some kind of a structure, how to become oriented and to give orientation for the client. On the other hand, I want to offer you some practical guidelines, how to ask, how to interview, and at the end I will give you some practical, I mean not guidelines, but some special support, how to be aware of the more nonverbal aspects while interviewing. And at the end, if there are questions, we can talk a little about it, or you can try to practice it at home in a seminar or in small groups, and then maybe later you have more questions after you have practiced. So then we can maybe at another day in January or February, we can well, talk about the questions, the practical questions you have after you have practiced with the first interview. Is it okay? So I will start. No, this is not the one. This is the one. And of course, I can send you the PPT afterwards, so you don't have to write down everything what you think it is important for you. You can just listen and watch, and of course, if you want to put down some notes, you're welcome. I have listed some guidelines in the beginning, and these guidelines are basically important when starting a session, a general session, or the first diagnostic interview in body psychotherapy. And I mostly refer to the first diagnostic interview, and I will just read them and just do a little or add a little comment to this, so that you feel more orientation on the one hand, and on the other hand, I tried to make it quite simple so that you also feel invited and motivated and invited to start with such an interview. And in the beginning, you know this, when you start with something new, of course, it is some kind of experiment. And in an experiment, it is important to be open enough to what you face and what you experience and what happens in the situation. So in such an experiment, it is important to be open enough and not to start with questions which are too focused. So when you start this kind of interview, a brief introduction is necessary. Just like I do now, I tell you a little about the structure of the procedure. What will happen in this hour, or in this session, or in this interview, so that the client knows at least a little what will happen in the next hour or 1.5 hours. So I start in a more general way, perhaps with the question, tell me about your life, about you as a person, and of course, about your complaints, about things you suffer from. And I add, which is appropriate for you, what you want to tell me, and this is important, which is important for you so that I can understand you better. So I invite him to share something about himself, and at the same time, I refer to our relationship, that he does not only say something, but also thinks about, well, what could be helpful for the therapist to understand me in a better way. So the client starts as he spontaneously wants to do so, or how he's able to. So there is no specific start or procedure. So I ask him, well, I usually start with this question: tell me about your life, about your person, and what do you think it is important for me to know? So principally choose general questions in the beginning and not too focused questions, as I told you. Because when you start with too focused questions, you narrow the space for experience. Later, of course, it is important to add focused questions, more specified questions, but not in the beginning. And at the same time, the client becomes the feeling of, well, I can perform, I can present myself in a way how I am able to, and not to fulfill a special demand or a special procedure which he has to follow. And this, of course, is also motivating the client to feel safe in this situation. And this feeling of safety, of course, is very important, especially in the beginning. So when he starts, for example, talking about his mother and then about his father, he can choose this in the way as he wants to. He can start with the father or the mother, or about his actual life, his job, or his suffering. So be aware of what the client chooses first and what he tells later, or even does not refer to. For example, sometimes I ask them, well, tell me about your parents, about your family. So this is an open question. And I'm curious, how does the client start? Does he start with his mother, with his father, with his siblings, or with his childhood in general? And I sometimes, for example, experience that the client starts with his mother and talks about for 5 minutes. And then he does not talk about his father, or about his father only in half a minute. So this is okay. But it is important for me to be aware of this, because probably this has a meaning, which we later will find out. But I don't confront the client like, oh, well, you talk about a lot about your mother, and how about your father? You did not say so much. Because then I value, and I give him the feeling of, well, I was not right. I did not do it in the right way. So the client may do this because it is his spontaneous expression. And this is, as I told you, to be assessed diagnostically. So I keep this in my mind, or I put down a note. The client's decision to tell or not to tell this, or that, is also an expression of an emotionally born, unconscious choice. So he did an emotional choice to start with his mother or with his father, about his childhood in general, or about his grandfather. So I'm always aware of the information and aware of the choice. So the therapist then asks about what was not said by the client, or what was left out. Is there something left out or missing, which is important? You see, I always start again with an open question. And then the client reacts, oh, I forgot my father, perhaps. Or he says, well, I don't know if something is missing. And then this is some kind of an invitation for me to ask him, well, you have father and mother in your family, and you told me a lot about your mother. How about your father? You know, so I go step by step with little steps and open up and become, and the interview becomes a bit more, not focused, but more to the actual situation, because he has parents in his life. And then maybe I ask him for concrete examples or persons which were relevant in his life. For example, when he said, well, my mother was caring, then I maybe after a while, I ask, well, your mother was caring. Can you give me an example how she did it or how you experience this? So it is still open enough. Or I ask, is this now like this? Or do you know this from your childhood perhaps, or from your work? So I change from the actual situation, maybe, to the time before. When the client uses a word like, I feel good, or it is fine, or I didn't like it, or so, then I invite him to use other words for this, because this is a general statement which does not mean anything. And to confront him is not good. So I ask him, oh, I see it was good for you. Well, everybody senses this, what is good, in a very personal way, in a different way. So do you have other words for what is not good or what it is good? So I invite him in a gentle way to install trust again, to give him the feeling of, well, I accept when you say it is good, or it is wrong, or okay. And still, I'm more interested in you personally. And that's why I asked you. And this is now very specific, and I work with this for more than 40 years now. I try to ask 2 questions, sometimes or later in the interview, at the same time, or in the therapy. So I ask 2 questions at the same time and refer to 2 different perspectives, so that one can learn more about his unconscious, emotionally born choice. For example, I ask, oh, what happens in your body and what do you feel? So I refer to the perspective of body and to the perspective of emotions. And I do this because, again, the client has to make a choice how he wants to start. Does he want to start with talking about his body, or about his emotions, or maybe about something else? So by offering this, I confront him, so to say, a little, because now he has to make an emotional choice. And this is helpful for me to diagnose. Does he talk more about his feelings, or about his body, or about his relationship, or about his thoughts, about his fantasies? So this, you know, it opens up a space of experience, and at the same time, it it offers some more diagnostic specific information, which is hidden, which is unconscious. So I listen in general to the words, what he talks about, what he shares, and I'm aware on the body level, what happens there. For example, if somebody talks about his mother, he talks like this, and then he starts talking about his father, maybe the sound of his voice changes a little. Maybe he talks like this about his mother, and then a bit more, a bit louder with his, you know, about his father. So you get 2 information at the same time. The words, how does he think about his father, what his father is like. And on the other hand, I get an information, an emotional or bodily information, by listening to the voice, the sound of the voice, which is louder. But I don't refer to this. Later I refer to this, but not in that moment. So first I'm aware. Then I ask again in general, do you want to add something? Is something missing? So that I can understand you better. So it is an invitation again, and not, well, you did not tell me enough about your father, because this is demotivating. So in the beginning, it is very important to motivate and not to, or to reject somehow. So always be aware of what the client talks about and how the client reacts on the body level, non-verbally. As I told you, be aware of the emotional sound of the voice. And again, as I told you in the beginning, keep it simple. Very simple in the first interview. Open questions, motivation, and installing a good, trustful relationship to the client. So this is, so to say, a more general approach, how to address in general the client in this first interview. And now I want to refer.
Can I ask a question before?
Yes.
What do you mean by motivate and not rejection? Like,
well,
I didn't understand that.
When I ask him, or when he talks about his parents, he talks 5 minutes about his mother and maybe only half a minute about his father. Okay, that's okay for me. But I realize there is a big difference. So how to address the client and invite him so that he feels good enough to tell more about his father. So this is my motivation. So there are two ways how to handle the situation. On the one hand, I can tell him, okay, you told me 5 minutes about your mother, but only half a minute about your father. What is the matter with your father that you only told me half a minute? So then in some way I judge, and I give him the impression, perhaps the impression, oh, it was not good enough to talk only half a minute about my father. Okay, well, now I tell you more about my father because I want to be a good client, you know? So to avoid this, I ask him, oh, well, you told me 5 minutes about your mother. And how about your father? You told me some little aspects. Is there perhaps something more you want to add? You know? So I remind him, well, you did not say so much. Well, it is fine for me. But I'm interested in getting to know more about your father. Because then I don't reject him. You know? Is it okay? Okay. So perhaps some of you have read the paper on the first interview, which I published in English. I will refer to the structure, and at the end, I will show the whole structure again, how the different levels are connected. So first, I just give you the input of those steps, so to say. So in the beginning, I told you I ask about the family, about his life, and what is happening in his life, what happened in his life, what was important in his life, and so on and so on. So I refer to biography, to his life, to his current life, to his relationships, and of course, to the problem, the suffering, the complaints which he has. And I want to get an impression about his background. And at the same time, I want to get an impression of how the client focuses on his complaints and his suffering. And so to say, does he have a name for this? And so I question in this way with open questions. And this can maybe happen for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Well, it depends, you know. And the more you become familiar with this, the more you can how to say, ask clear enough, concrete enough, but still open enough. So of course, I'm aware in the beginning, while the client is talking, I'm aware about the body reaction. How is he breathing? How is he sitting in his chair? Or does he stand up and walk in the room? Or does he sometimes, this happened sometimes in my practice, that the client sits down beside the chair and not in the chair. So I just realize this. I'm aware of this, but I don't refer to this. Or I try to get an impression about his gestures, about his facial expression, about the sound of the voice, and how this, maybe as I told you with this example, when the client talks about his mother, he talks normally, and when he starts talking about his father, he raises the sound of his voice. So I just realize this. I'm aware of this. And at the same time, I listen to the words. So I try to keep this in my mind, because later it will become more important to refer to this, the way how he talks and about what he talks. So then maybe I start some kind of deeper exploration. As I told you with this example, oh, well, you talked about your mother for 5 minutes and with your father for half a minute. I'm interested to get to know more about your father. So I focus more, but I don't ask closed questions, just like, oh, is there nothing else you have to talk about your father? Because this is a closed question, which is more or less rejecting. Or on the other hand, it gives you, the client, only the chance saying yes or no, you know. So it is this, well, it brings the relationship in a disbalance. And of course, I try to connect some of my experience, how he is talking and what he's talking about. For example, later, maybe after 25 minutes, maybe I can share and give the feedback to the client. Oh, well, when you were talking about your mother, you talked like you did in the beginning, and it seemed to be your normal sound of voice. But when you started talking about your father, you raised the sound of your voice and you moved more in your chair. I just experience this. And then I can ask, well, how do you feel with this? Did you experience this by yourself or not? And this is a very important question, because people often don't realize this by themselves. So you as a therapist, when you look at this third aspect, you already start therapy, because you mirror him something which he's not aware of. So this is an important moment. And on the other hand, it starts already some kind of inner process in the client. So it is not a clinical interview, just like in a laboratory situation. You know, I ask, the client answers. I ask, the client answers. It is not like this. Of course, I get answers, but at the same time, I give some impulse. I give some feedback, so that the client becomes more aware of himself and perhaps starts talking more about this. Maybe he says, oh, well, I'm not aware of this. I talked in the same way. Or he says, oh, well, you are right. My friends always tell me that in specific situations, the sound of my voice raises. You know, because then you get a new important information, that he's aware of this and that this is part of the relationship when he talks with his friends or colleagues. So at the same time, you open up again for more diagnostic information. And then after a while, maybe after half an hour, 35 minutes, 40 minutes, but I talk about a session of 50 minutes. I'm interested to get to know what the client wants and needs, or if he has questions to me. And then I usually start in the way, well, I asked you a lot of questions before. And it was important for me because I need to get to know you better. So I asked you some questions. So I just want to change it over to you. I can imagine that you also have questions to me. Questions about me and my profession, about the moment here in the interview, or questions about yourself. For example, what do you want from me? What do you need? What do you expect from the therapy? And I don't yet start really asking for the goal of the therapy, because this is more or less an aspect to be discussed later. But I start in the way as I did with this. I change over to him. Well, you're also responsible for yourself, and you have questions to me or about yourself. Well, just let's start about this. So I, of course, and this is very necessary, I give some general answers about the situation, about myself. And then giving some answers to his questions. So my response and the impression of the various aspects, these are the most important things in that moment. And I connect this, of course, to A, B, C, which we talked about before. So the more, and I will talk about this later again. So I'm aware of how he responded unconsciously or emotionally. For example, when I asked him about his life, his childhood, or when I opened up some kind of, well, when I started to mirror him, how he talked about his father. So I put these things together, and then I, of course, have perhaps more questions to him, which are important. And I pick up the chance, like, oh, well, now when you ask me those questions and I give you some answer, I have another question in my mind, which helps me to understand you better. And then maybe I ask one or two more questions. And I also refer to the situation we are in. For example, maybe you remember you had some impression about my therapy room when we had one group session. I think I was in my therapy room, and you could see that there are many things, you know, some painting on the wall and some mattress and so on. And sometimes when the client, and maybe you remember, I think I gave you this example, when he enters the room and sits down, maybe in the beginning he just looks around and tries to get an impression of the situation. This is okay, and I'm aware of this, but usually I don't refer in the beginning to this. So, and I don't do this because I don't want to give the client the impression of whatever I do, the therapist notices this and I am under observation. Because this is not a helpful, motivating feeling, especially in the beginning. Of course, the client has this in his mind. How will the therapist talk to me? What will he see? What will he tell me? How can I hide things which I don't want to talk about? You know, this is all in his mind, half consciously or unconsciously or whatever. So I want to invite him to behave and to react, especially in the beginning, without getting the impression of, well, I'm under observation, or in an assessment, just like in an assessment when you start a new job. But later, I of course refer to this. For example, the client has told me that he does not trust people so much for whatever reason. Maybe later I mirror him this with the words, oh, well, you talked about that you have good reasons not to trust people so well. I can imagine that you have some reason and some experience. Maybe you will tell me a little more about it, but it's fine if you don't share now more about this, maybe later. But I can share one experience which I had when you entered the room. And then perhaps I mirror him, my observation. I tell him, oh, well, when you entered the room and sat down, you started looking around in the room. And then, of course, I share something about myself, like, okay, well, it is strange here. It is a new room, a new atmosphere for you. And I would do the same to become familiar with the space, the room where I am in now for an hour. This is very new to me. So I also would look around. And then I throw the ball over to him and I ask him, okay, and what did you see when you looked around? I don't refer to the assessment or observation issue. I try to anchor, so to say, to ground him in the way as he tried to become familiar with the situation by asking him, well, what do you see? Or I ask him again, will you look around again now and we can talk about things which you see in my room? For example, one client told me, well, there is a mattress. Why is this mattress here? And by the sound of his voice, I realize he's anxious. And then I pick it up and explain, like, well, you must know I'm a body psychotherapist and I work by talking and by referring to the body. And sometimes it happens that maybe the client wants to lie down. So I offer him some kind of information. I try to reduce his anxiety. And again, I offer him the choice. If you want to, or if a client wants to lie down on the mattress, okay, the client can do. But this also induces the possibility the client does not have to. So if the client does not want to, okay, it is just a mattress in the room, nothing else. And by going on like this and being aware of the somehow hidden anxiety of the client, I can give him feedback. Like, oh, when you refer to the mattress and ask me, I saw some kind of hesitation in your face. Or do you have another question perhaps? Or how does it sound for you when I explain the reason why the mattress is here? So I refer to his anxiety without telling him, oh, I realize that you are anxious. Then of course the client will say, no, I'm not anxious. I just wonder about the mattress. I never saw this before. You know, so I always try to become more information, more diagnostic information, try to motivate and invite the client to open up in our relationship, and that he feels safe. And I don't want to assess him in the way like in an assessment, as I told you, when you start business somewhere and people want to get to know you better, then they send you to an assessment center. This is not the way we choose in this kind of interview. So, of course, I can focus a bit more now when I go on. For example, when he reacted more on the emotional level, I don't tell him, oh, well, you didn't say so much about your body. So this is more confronting, and I bring the client in disbalance or our relationship. So I told him, I will tell him, well, you told me a lot about your feelings, and I know now that you are very impressed by your feelings, and the emotionality is very important for you. And how about your body? Can you tell me a bit more about your body? Because the body is connected with your feelings, or we express feelings by our body. No, then of course I focus a bit more. Of course I refer more to his experience. And I open up again various perspectives. Or I can focus a bit more on our relationship in that interview. For example, I could say, well, you told me a lot about your emotionality, and how do you feel in our interview now, in our first session? Will you tell me a little about your feelings now? Or what happens in your body when you are here and we don't know each other, we see for the first time, and I ask you questions and you answer. And what happens in your body when you do this, when you are here? So I try to really to really ground, to ground and to install more and more trust and get more information. And after that, to finish up, I by myself say, okay, well, now we have to look for the time, and of course we have only a specific space of time. Is this okay for you? I would like to see how we can find some kind of goal for the therapy, which includes your complaints, your wishes, your interest, your questions, and things you suffer from. And then usually the client says, yes, that's fine. And I also was thinking about this. And, so I pick this up, and I usually start with an open question. Like, well, after this interview now, what is your impression? What do you need from the therapy? What do you need from me in the therapy? And then he shares a little. And then I pick up my impression and relate this to what the client has told me. So, for example, when he's this kind of anxious person, he does not want to lie down, and he looks around in the room when he enters, and maybe he is does not say so much about his father, then of course I would pick this up in the way like, well, I see, and the client by himself says, well, I want to feel more strength in myself, more power, more self-trust. Then I refer to this and refer this to some information which I got in the interview, which the client already has shown up or talked about. For example, I can remind him in that moment well, it is a good way to build up more self-trust. I realize that you just started your new job, and this is a new situation, and you don't know what happens there, and you like the job, but you don't know the people. And so I think it is very important to feel stronger, more self-trust, more relaxed and more grounded, to do a better job and to feel better by this. And then maybe I can relate at the same time to what he talked about his father. Maybe I can share, like, oh, well, you told me about your father, that he was a very strong person and he put a lot of pressure on you and you had to obey, and sometimes maybe he hit you. And I can imagine that this experience had some kind of influence on you and your self-trust. So perhaps when we start with this goal, with your goal, referring to self-trust, I think it is also important to talk about your father and the relationship to your father in your childhood. So, you know, I pick up the goal, put into words by the client himself, and to open it up to some information which he had shown to me and impressions which I got. And at the same time, I open up therapy, because therapy is not only just like when I do A, B, C, D, I have more self-trust. This is not the way how it works. So people sometimes expect this. So when I open this up, I refer to his need, the suffering, to the emotional part, to the relationship to his family, to his biography, and to his actual situation in the new job. You see, I try to construct somehow, based on the experience in this session, to construct somehow a picture where he feels, oh, that is me. And a picture which mirrors also the relationship between him and me, what he told me, and my impression. So he feels safe and interested and motivated enough to become aware or to experience more of the different perspectives which are connected in that moment. And this is enough for the first session. This is a very condensed experience, really. But this is maybe I should finish this aspect with one sentence. You now see this structure. It is an invitation for you to experiment with yourself and with your colleagues and with clients. But at the same time, of course, it is a very intensive or condensed structure. So please don't, oh no, I'm putting it in another word. Please try to be motivated to start in a way which is possible for you. Because at the end, there is no right or wrong. You pick up those information and impression and experience which is possible, which you and the client can bring together. And this is right. Maybe during the session or after the session, you have the idea, oh, well, I missed to talk about this, and I missed to give him feedback, and I missed, you know, okay. Then you have the next session as a chance to pick this up. So the first session always is right enough, as Winnicott said. You know Winnicott, the psychoanalyst? Yeah, he said, it is not possible to be a good mother or a good father. You can only be good enough. So in this situation, as a therapist in the first interview, you can only be good enough therapist in that moment. And this is important. And this is what the client needs. And this is what is helpful. So now I bring this, the different steps, so to say, together. It is, well, we started with A and then B, C, D, you know, and then when I referred to C, I told you, well, this is connected somehow, no? This is connected to A and B. And when we, at the end, that is E, when we are there, of course, we relate to the experience in the beginning. And this is some kind of circular questioning. So I don't go step by step, A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on. So of course, this is some kind of an inner ladder or an inner stairs, A, B, C, D. But I always have in mind that they are connected. And when you feel and when you sense, oh, well, now I have to give him some feedback to how he reacted on the B level, on the body level. Okay, I give him some feedback. And later, when I told you, he enters the room, the client, and he looks around and seems to be anxious. Then at the end, as I told you, F and G step, then I can connect this experience from the first moment to his anxiety and to the goal. You know, so you can, I mean, when I refer to this kind of a systemic or a circular creation you do together. And of course, it is you and the client together, how you two bring those perspectives together. And of course, there can be some kind of critical moments, especially in D and E. Because in the beginning, ABC, it is more the client talks and shares, and you get an impression and you mirror him a little. But later, when you, for example, on the level of D or E, when you maybe refer to the father, because he had only talked about his father for half a minute, and you maybe want to refer to his father in a very gentle way or motivating way, but still there is a deep, deep conflict or some kind of abuse in the background, some kind of deep traumatization, which you don't know. Maybe in that moment when you refer to this, maybe he reacts very emotionally. I told you I don't want to talk about my father anymore. Okay, this can happen. So be aware that the more you go on with the client from ABC to DE, it can happen that there will be some deeper expressed emotionality or resistance. And this is okay. But don't step into that moment like, oh, I see that you are very angry about your father. Tell me more about your father. This is therapy. Not when he wants to talk in this way about his father in that moment, please stay in the structure. Mirror him as it is in DE. Mirror him. Oh, I realize that you are very angry. And you must have a good reason to be very angry on your father. But please forgive me, we don't have time and space in that moment now to talk more about this. Of course, we can do this the next time when we meet. But first of all, I have to get to know you better. And it is important that we install a good, trustful relationship. So you structure him a little. So it is not only open and explosion and whatever will happen. So this is some kind of introduction based on guidelines, based on the steps A, B, C, D, E, and by referring to possible circular effects which can happen. And I want to finish because, of course, we as a body psychotherapists refer to the body level. So we are aware of the body. And I am not sure if I showed you those questions before, but I want to bring this into your mind again, because they are very basic questions, important questions, and they are relevant in the diagnostic space and in the therapy space. So it is very easy, no? Where do you look first or not? Where does your look remain or not remain? What comes first into your mind and second, and which you perhaps don't realize? And well, how does the other move? How does he look in general? What is your association? For example, you can get the impression when he, for example, talks about his mother, well, his voice is a little childlike. Maybe you get the impression, oh, now a child talks to me and not a grown-up woman. Or a connotation, maybe you have some kind of connotation. Oh, well, he's very perfect in talking about his family. 5 minutes about his mother, 5 minutes about his father, 5 minutes about grandma, and you know, so you get the impression, and this is okay. And this has some kind of diagnostic value and information. And how does the voice sound? How does it change when he talks about his mother and his father? Or when you ask him a question, how does he react? Does he react spontaneously, directly? Or does he take a deep breath and waits for a moment? Or hesitates? And what changes while you talk with each other? Maybe he becomes more familiar and he does not look around in the room anymore because he feels more trust. Or he becomes nervous because you talk about his childhood. And what is obviously on first sight in your look and in your mind, or at the end. Maybe in the beginning you have the idea, oh, that's a strange person. He looks around in my room and does not dare to sit down. And he asked me, where shall I sit down? And what a weird person. And at the end, perhaps you remember that you had the impression of the client being like a child. They say, okay, well, maybe it is a vulnerable child, which is anxious, who is anxious. And what do you experience? What do you feel when you are looking on the body? Maybe sometimes, and I remember this, sometimes it is not so often. It feels for me that I don't dare to look directly at this person. Or I hesitate a little when asking a question. So I use my own body, I use my own countertransference, or my echo. It's countertransference is too early to talk about this, but it's some kind of an echo, an emotional echo in myself, a resonance. I'm also aware of this. But I don't talk about this, but I'm aware of this because later I guess that this will have an importance in our relationship or in the work when we start therapy. So I finish with this lecture, and I hope I could give you some more, a better picture, so to say, and not an impression which you got when you read the paper on the first interview. So I hope I could invite you to experiment, to be open, that you are open for yourself also, and that you do it good enough, I'm sure. And maybe it is important for you that you pick up the chance to work in the small groups together, that one is a therapist, one is the client, and one is the observer. Or you do this in the big group, perhaps, because then you have a more differentiated feedback from the others. So it is up to you to, well, to experience yourself with the diagnostic interview, even if you don't start a therapy afterwards. It can also be an interview in a non-therapeutic situation. Maybe you work in the field of social work somehow in a oh yes, I remember that you at the university have some kind of project, some kind of social projects. Perhaps you can try this in such a project. So I want to finish. You are always good enough. Try to experiment and to experience, and try to, well, to open up this in your, well, in a seminar, in a small group, or in such a social project. And finally, perhaps we can, maybe in January or in, yeah, January, perhaps we can have another a session on your experience, how you did it, how you experienced yourself, how the feedback was, you know. And this is what I wanted to open up to you now, and I wish you, well, good success, of course, and a lot of adrenaline and a lot sweating, because you have to stay in your structure. You cannot do this for 2 hours, you know. Of course, in the beginning, you do it for maybe 30 minutes or 60 minutes. And so don't keep rigidly, you know, to 50 minutes or 45 minutes. So invite yourself and become familiar and trust yourself in doing this. Okay. So you can imagine, so you can think about it in your group, how to handle the practical part, how to experiment yourself, and, well, give me then the feedback whenever it is ready for you, when we should meet again, if this is necessary or not, to talk about your questions. Okay. So I wish you a nice afternoon, a nice weekend. And okay, well, we have 1 hour. It's a good job we did. And well, I can share something personal at the end. You know, I have two souls in my heart. One is I'm a little well, curious, chaotic, experiencing, open, and so on. And the other one is I like also to structure sometimes, and this helps me to come to an end, to a success, to a result, and to feel myself. And both is, I mean, important. So this is a more structure part. And when we talk about group process or some other aspect, this is a more the experience part. So I wish you all the best, and we see again, and wish you a nice weekend. And if we don't see again, Merry Christmas. Okay.
Thanks for your time, and Merry Christmas, Ulrich.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.